The first thing I noticed wasn't the door itself. It was the way the lock didn't resist me. For 70 years, my hands have known the weight of small, ordinary things. Door handles, keys, light switches. You don't think about them until one day, something feels wrong. That afternoon, my key slid in too easily. No resistance, no click, just a soft turn like the door had been waiting for me. I stood there longer than I should have, my fingers still wrapped around the key, my breath shallow. The hallway was quiet. No footsteps, no voices. Nothing broken, nothing obvious. And yet every instinct I had was telling me I wasn't alone in my own life anymore. I told myself not to be dramatic. That's what people say to men my age when we hesitate. You're imagining things. You're tired. You're grieving. I had heard all of it before. Still, I didn't step inside right away. I listened. I counted. I waited. That moment standing in the doorway of my own apartment was the first time I understood that something had already started without my permission. I didn't know yet that I would eventually count that moment as number one. I only knew that whatever this was, it wasn't care. And it wasn't an accident. By the time I closed that door behind me, the trap had already begun to take shape. I lived alone by choice. After my wife passed, well-meaning friends kept suggesting alternatives. A smaller place closer to family, a spare room at my son's house. Assisted living brochures slid across tables like condolences. I thanked them and declined every time. Independence wasn't stubbornness to me. It was dignity. My apartment was modest, quiet, and predictable. Everything had its place. Everything answered to me. That predictability mattered more than people realized. When you lose someone after decades, the world doesn't fall apart all at once. It leaks. Slowly, in small inconvenient ways. And routine is what keeps the floor from giving out under your feet. I had built mine carefully. The mornings were quiet. Coffee by the window, the same chair, the same mug. My afternoons were slower but deliberate. I locked my door every time I left, not out of fear, but habit. 70 years teaches you that habits are how you stay standing when everything else shifts. My daughter-in-law entered my life gently at first. After the funeral, she started checking in. A call here, a text there. Did I need anything? Was I eating, sleeping? I appreciated it more than I admitted. Concern feels warm when it's new, especially when it's wrapped in smiles and soft voices and the language of family. She had a key, just in case, she said. In case something happened, in case I fell, in case I didn't answer my phone one day. I agreed without much thought. I was still learning how to be alone, and it felt easier to say yes than to explain myself. The first time she came in without telling me, I didn't even call it that. I noticed it the way you notice a draft. Subtle, a feeling more than a fact. The lamp by the couch was off when I knew I'd left it on. The bathroom door wasn't quite where I'd closed it. The refrigerator light caught my eye like it had been opened recently. I stood there, keys still in my hand, again replaying the morning in my head. I remembered locking the door. I remembered checking the handle twice. I always did. That hadn't changed just because my hair had turned gray. Still, I didn't accuse. I didn't confront. I didn't even name it. I told myself she must have stopped by, that it was concern, that this was what family did when they worried about someone my age living alone. I told myself to be grateful. Gratitude is an easy mask when you don't want to look too closely at what's underneath. The second time happened 3 days later. This time the door was locked, but the air felt different. I know how that sounds. Vague, convenient, like something an old man would say when he couldn't explain himself. But there are changes you feel before you can articulate them. The smell of cleaner I don't use. A stack of mail shifted just enough that it caught my eye. I stood in the middle of my living room and let the silence settle. No noise, no missing items, no sign of panic, just the quiet certainty that I was no longer the only one moving through my space. That night I sat at my kitchen table longer than usual. I didn't eat much. I kept replaying the way she had laughed the last time we spoke, brushing off my offer to stop by her place instead. "Don't worry about me," she'd said. "We'll take care of things." We. The word stayed with me. The third time was when I stopped dismissing coincidence. A drawer in my desk had been opened. Not rummaged through, not emptied, just opened. Papers shifted enough that I could see the edges didn't line up the way I always kept them. I have never been careless with documents. Old habits from a lifetime of work don't disappear just because you retire. I sat down slowly and closed the drawer, then opened it again. Everything was there, nothing missing. But something had been looked at. Not curiosity, assessment. That was when I started counting. Not out of anger, not out of fear, out of necessity. Numbers don't argue back. They don't accuse. They just exist. 1, 2, 3. I kept the count in my head at first the way I'd kept figures straight my entire career. I didn't write anything down yet. Writing makes things real. I wasn't ready for that. I didn't say anything to her. I didn't say anything to my son. Silence felt safer than doubt. If I was wrong, silence would protect me from embarrassment. If I was right, silence would protect me from being dismissed. What I didn't understand yet was that silence once chosen doesn't belong to you alone. As the days passed, her visits became more casual. She mentioned stopping by like it was nothing. Like she was doing me a favor. Once she joked that I should be grateful someone cared enough to check in on me. I smiled and nodded and let the comment pass, even though something in my chest tightened when she said it. I had lived long enough to know when a line was being tested. Still, I told myself this could be handled with a simple conversation. A gentle reminder. A boundary set politely the way adults do. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't afraid. I was unsettled. By the end of the first week, the count had reached 4. By the end of the second, it was 7. I stopped pretending it was random. Patterns reveal themselves whether you're ready or not. And once you see one, you can't unsee it. One evening, sitting alone with the lights low, I realized something else. Every time she came in, she stayed a little longer. Every time she seemed more comfortable. As if my silence wasn't reassurance, but permission. That was the moment I understood that whatever this was, it wouldn't stop on its own. 3 months later, when everything was finally over, I would sit down and write that first day at the top of a page. Entry 1. Not because it was the worst, but because it was the beginning. Back then, though, I only knew this. If someone was counting on me to stay quiet, they were right. They just didn't understand why. Silence has a way of smoothing things over, especially when you want it to. After the first time, I convinced myself it was harmless. After the second, I told myself I was being uncharitable. By the third, I stopped using words like accident in my head, but I still avoided saying intrusion. Language matters. The words you choose decide how far you're willing to go. The next time I found the door unlocked, it was early in the morning. The sun was barely up, that pale gray light that makes everything look unfinished. I had stepped out to pick up groceries, gone no more than 40 minutes. When I returned, the handle turned without resistance again. I stood there longer this time. There was no panic in me, just a tightening behind the ribs. I stepped inside slowly, as if movement itself might erase evidence. The lights were off. I was certain I had left one on in the kitchen. The bathroom window was cracked open just enough to let air in. I never left it that way. Never had. I closed it, locked the door, and leaned my forehead against the glass for a moment. I told myself I would mention it casually the next time I saw her. Not accuse. Just clarify. Clarify was a safe word. Neutral. Reasonable. But the moment never came. She called that afternoon, her voice bright and effortless. She mentioned stopping by as if it were an errand, like picking up milk on the way home. I caught myself gripping the phone too tightly. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay, she said. You didn't answer earlier. I hadn't seen a missed call. I said thank you. I always said thank you. Gratitude became a reflex, even when it didn't fit. The next entry happened 2 days later. This time the door was locked when I returned, which somehow made it worse. It meant the lock hadn't been forgotten. It had been used. Inside, the changes were subtle again. The mail on the counter had been shifted into a neater stack. One envelope turned face down. My chair pulled slightly away from the table. It felt like someone had walked through my life and straightened it according to their own standards. I sat down and tried to recall every movement I'd made that morning. Memory is a careful thing. People think it fades with age, but what really fades is patience for nonsense. I knew what I'd done. I knew what I hadn't. That night, I counted for the first time out loud. 1. I said it quietly, as if the walls were listening. The next time, I counted 2. It wasn't anger that made me start counting. It was relief. Numbers don't question you. They don't ask if you're tired or lonely or imagining things. They sit there steady and unchanging. I had spent my life trusting them when people became unreliable. The visits continued close enough together that they could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Sometimes the changes were obvious. Sometimes they were so small, I wondered if I was looking for them. But every time the feeling was the same, a sense of being managed. She started using different language too. Instead of asking if she could stop by, she'd say she had stopped by. Instead of checking whether I needed anything, she'd tell me what she'd noticed. The refrigerator was too empty. The trash hadn't been taken out yet. I should keep the windows closed at night. Each comment was small, almost thoughtful on its own. Together, they formed something else entirely. The 5th entry was when I realized she was touching things she had no reason to touch. I had left a folder on my desk closed and neatly stacked. When I came back, it was open, not rifled through. Just opened, the top page lifted slightly as if someone had paused mid-thought. Financial documents aren't interesting to most people. To someone with an agenda, they're a map. I closed the folder carefully and slid it back into place. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I didn't confront her then, not because I was afraid of her reaction, but because I understood something I hadn't before. If I accused her without proof, she would deny it. And denial would be followed by concern, and concern would be followed by questions about my memory. I had already heard the first version of that script, so I stayed quiet. The counting became automatic. I stopped telling myself I'd stop. I didn't even think about it consciously anymore. Entry 6. Entry 7. Each time I marked it mentally and moved on. Outwardly, nothing changed. I smiled. I thanked her. I nodded when she suggested things. Inwardly, something was shifting. The visits grew bolder. She stopped mentioning them altogether. No calls, no texts. Just presence. I'd come home to a space that had been lived in without me. Coffee cups moved. A blanket folded differently. Signs of familiarity that hadn't been earned. Once I found a note on the counter reminding me to take my medication. I don't forget my medication. I never have. That note stayed there for hours before I finally threw it away. I told myself that if I said something now, it would only escalate things in the wrong direction. Boundaries once challenged aren't restored by politeness alone. They're restored by leverage. And I didn't have that yet. By the end of the first month, the count reached 12. 12 times in 30 days, my door had been opened without my permission. 12 times my space had been entered under the banner of care. 12 times I had said nothing. I wasn't confused. I wasn't helpless. I was watching. The hardest part wasn't the intrusion itself. It was the way my silence was being interpreted. Each visit seemed to reinforce her confidence. Each unchallenged entry made her more comfortable, less cautious. She moved through my apartment like someone who expected no resistance. I recognized that posture. I had seen it before years ago in boardrooms and quiet offices where people believed their authority was unquestioned. Confidence born from assumption is the most dangerous kind. One evening, as I sat alone with the lights dimmed, I realized I had crossed a line of my own. I was no longer asking myself whether this would stop. I was asking myself when it would change, because patterns don't dissolve on their own. They escalate. The phone rang shortly after that thought settled. It was her again, cheerful as ever. She mentioned she'd stopped by earlier, said she was glad I seemed fine. I thanked her and hung up. I didn't correct her. I didn't ask her to stop. Not because I couldn't. Because I was beginning to understand that stopping her wasn't the point anymore. By the time the count reached 15, I knew exactly what I was dealing with. And by the time it reached 20, I understood that whatever came next would not involve another polite conversation. I could have ended it then. I could have demanded my key back. I could have raised my voice and made it ugly. Instead, I did nothing. That decision, more than any other, is what changed everything. I waited longer than I should have before saying anything. By the time I decided to speak, the count had already climbed high enough that silence felt less like patience and more like permission. I could feel the balance tipping the way it does when you let something continue just a little too long. I told myself that a calm conversation would reset things, that boundaries, once stated clearly, would be respected. I wanted to believe that, because believing it was easier than admitting what it would mean if they weren't. I chose the moment carefully. Not in my apartment, not on the phone. I didn't want witnesses, but I didn't want corners either. I waited until I ran into her in the parking area outside my building, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Neutral ground. No raised voices. No doors to slam. She smiled when she saw me, the same smile she always used. Warm, familiar, disarming. I remember thinking briefly that maybe I really was about to overreact. I started gently. I always did. I told her I appreciated her concern. I told her I knew she meant well. I told her I was grateful she checked in on me after my wife passed. Every sentence was padded, softened, careful. I avoided the word entered. I said stopped by instead. I avoided saying without permission. I said unexpectedly. Then I asked her, as calmly as I could, to stop coming into my apartment unless I had asked her to. That was all. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't mention the number of times. I framed it as a preference, not a demand. Privacy matters to me, I said. It helps me feel settled. I kept my tone even respectful, almost apologetic. For half a second, she just looked at me. Then she laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in the way people expect cruelty to sound. It was quick and light, like I had just made an amusing observation about the weather. She shook her head slightly and waved a hand in the air, dismissing the entire idea before it had even finished landing. "Oh, Elias," she said, still smiling. "You're overthinking this." The words slid into place with unsettling ease. She told me she was just checking on me, that it was no big deal, that I was reading too much into things. Her voice stayed soft, reasonable, almost soothing. Anyone overhearing us would have assumed she was calming me down. That was when she introduced my age into the conversation. Not directly, not yet. She didn't say old. She said sensitive. She said emotional. She said it was normal to feel unsettled after losing someone, especially at my stage of life. She said she worried that being alone might be making things feel bigger than they were. Each word landed gently. Together they formed something sharp. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I didn't interrupt her. I listened the way I had learned to listen when someone was telling me exactly who they were without realizing it. She talked about my son, about how much he worried, about how they both wanted to make sure I was okay. She said we all just wanted the same thing: safety, stability, peace of mind. There it was again. I realized then that this conversation wasn't about my apartment at all. It was about credibility, about who would be believed if this went any further. And she was already positioning herself on the right side of that equation. I told her I wasn't confused. I told her I remembered things clearly. I told her I locked my door every time. I kept my voice steady, even as I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. She smiled again, slower this time. "That's not what I meant," she said. "Of course you remember things. I'm just saying sometimes stress does funny things, especially when you're alone." It wasn't concern anymore. It was calibration. I understood then that explaining myself was a mistake. Every sentence I added gave her something else to reinterpret. Every defense sounded to her like proof. So I stopped talking. The silence unsettled her just a little. She filled it quickly, assuring me again that she meant no harm, that she would be more mindful, that she didn't want me to feel uncomfortable. Her words piled up, smoothing over the moment as if it had never happened. Before we parted, she mentioned my son again, casually. She said she might talk to him later just to ease his mind. She said he'd been worried lately. It wasn't a threat. It didn't need to be. I went back to my apartment and locked the door behind me slower than usual. I stood there, hands still on the knob, listening to the quiet. My pulse took longer to settle than I expected. That night I didn't sleep much. I replayed the conversation in my head, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't agreed to stop. She hadn't even acknowledged that my request was reasonable. She had simply reframed it until I was the problem. By morning, I knew something had changed. The entries didn't stop after that conversation. They increased. It was as if my request had done the opposite of what I intended. Instead of pulling back, she seemed emboldened. The visits came closer together. The changes inside my apartment grew more pronounced. She no longer bothered to tidy afterward. It was as though she wanted me to notice. Once I found my trash already taken out when I knew I hadn't done it. Another time, a grocery bag sat on the counter, items I hadn't asked for arranged neatly inside. Care performed loudly enough to override consent. My phone rang more often, too. Not from her, from my son. His tone was different now. Careful, measured. He asked questions that felt rehearsed. How was I sleeping? Was I eating enough? Did I feel safe living alone? The language was familiar. I had just heard it. I answered honestly. I kept my voice calm. I didn't mention his wife by name. I focused on facts. I told him I was fine. He didn't argue with me. He didn't accuse me of anything. He just didn't sound convinced. That was the moment I stopped expecting to be believed. The realization settled quietly without drama. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt in the way people imagine. I felt something colder, clearer. I understood that this situation would not be resolved through conversation. Not with her, not with him. Words had already been assigned meanings that didn't belong to me. If I continued to explain myself, I would only feed the story being built around me. So I did the only thing left to do. I said nothing. I smiled when she stopped by. I thanked her when she mentioned checking on me. I didn't correct her. I didn't push back. Outwardly, I became exactly what she expected me to be. Inwardly, I started paying closer attention. The count kept rising. By the time it passed 20, I wasn't surprised anymore. I wasn't even unsettled. I was alert, calm, focused in a way I hadn't been since my working years. I realized then that silence once chosen can be sharpened, and I was done using mine defensively. From that point on, every quiet moment had a purpose. The change didn't arrive with an argument. It arrived with a tone. When my son called me the morning after one of her longer visits, I recognized it immediately. His voice was slower, more deliberate, as if he were choosing each word carefully. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't angry. He sounded prepared. That frightened me more than shouting ever could. He asked how I was doing, not casually, formally. the way doctors ask before they begin explaining results. I told him I was fine. I said it plainly without embellishment. There was a pause on the line just long enough for me to know that fine was not the answer he'd expected. He asked if I'd been sleeping well. I said yes. He asked if I'd been eating regularly. I said yes. Then he asked if I ever felt confused. The question was gentle. Too gentle. It didn't accuse. It didn't confront. It simply hovered there, waiting to be answered in the wrong way. I told him no. I told him I felt clear. I told him I had routines and that I followed them. Another pause. He said he was glad to hear that. He said he and his wife had just been worried. He said she'd mentioned a few things that made her wonder if I might be struggling more than I let on. There it was. I felt something settle in my chest, heavy and final. Not anger. Recognition. I asked him what kinds of things. He hesitated just enough to suggest he'd already rehearsed this part. He said she'd noticed I sometimes left lights on, that my fridge was occasionally too empty, that I didn't always answer my phone right away. He laughed softly when he said it, as if to signal that none of it was serious. I listened without interrupting. Every example was harmless on its own. Together they painted a picture that wasn't me. A picture of someone drifting. Someone disorganized, someone who needed oversight. I understood the danger of that picture immediately. Once it exists, it doesn't need proof. It only needs repetition. I told him I locked my door every time I left. I told him I remembered exactly what I did each morning. I told him I had always lived quietly, even before his mother died. He didn't argue with me. That was when I knew belief had already shifted. He reassured me that no one was accusing me of anything. He said they just wanted to be proactive. He said it was better to address these things early before they became problems. He said he hoped I understood that this came from love. Love framed as evaluation. I felt the impulse to defend myself rise up hot and immediate. To list facts, to give examples, to explain how carefully I lived my life, how much effort it took to remain independent at my age, how insulted I was by the implication that I couldn't be trusted in my own home. I didn't do any of that. Because as he spoke, I realized something else. The language he was using wasn't his. It was borrowed. The phrasing, the cadence, even the pauses mirrored hers. This conversation hadn't begun with him. It had simply passed through him. When I asked if he believed I was confused, he didn't answer right away. He said he didn't know what to believe. He said he trusted me, but he also trusted his wife. He said it was difficult to be in the middle. He said he hoped I could see that. I did see it. I saw exactly where I stood. He suggested we make things easier on everyone. He said maybe it would help if she checked in more regularly. Maybe if they coordinated visits. Maybe if we shared access to things just in case. He said it wouldn't be permanent, just until everyone felt more comfortable. The words were gentle. The implication was not. This was the first time control was offered to me as a favor. I told him I would think about it. I told him I appreciated his concern. I told him I understood how stressful it must be to worry about a parent. I said everything he needed to hear. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at the surface as if it might explain something to me. The apartment felt smaller than it had before. Not physically, psychologically. As if the walls had shifted just enough to remind me that space is only yours as long as others agree to let it be. The visits increased after that call. She no longer bothered with subtlety. Sometimes I'd come home to find groceries already put away. Sometimes she rearranged my cabinets, explaining later that it made more sense this way. Once she mentioned that my bathroom could use safety bars, said it lightly as if it were a joke. Each action was framed as care. Each one chipped away at something I could feel slipping piece by piece. My son called more often. The questions became more specific. Did I remember to take my medication today? Did I know what day it was? Did I feel safe driving? He never raised his voice. He never accused me outright. He simply stopped sounding like someone who needed answers and started sounding like someone collecting them. I tried once more to explain. I told him carefully that I hadn't asked his wife to come in so often. I said it made me uncomfortable. I said I valued my privacy. I avoided the word intrusion. I avoided the word permission. I spoke the way a reasonable man speaks when he hopes reason still matters. He listened. He nodded, even though I couldn't see it. I could hear it in his tone. And then he said he understood, but he wasn't sure I was seeing the situation clearly. That sentence ended something inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically. It ended the way trust ends when it has been quietly eroded over time. You don't notice the final grain of sand fall away. You just realize one day that there's nothing left to stand on. After that, I stopped trying to be understood. I stopped correcting small misstatements. I stopped clarifying timelines. I stopped offering explanations that could be repurposed against me. I answered questions with fewer words. I smiled more. I thanked them both whenever they checked in. Outwardly, I became agreeable. Inwardly, I became alert. I began to see the pattern with a clarity that surprised me. The concern escalated only when I resisted. The suggestions became more structured only after I asked for space. Each time I tried to assert myself, the response wasn't negotiation. It was escalation, disguised as help. This wasn't about safety. It was about authority. I understood then that if this continued, the next step wouldn't be a conversation. It would be documentation, professionals, assessments, paperwork. The kind of process that doesn't require your consent once it's underway. That was when fear finally arrived. Not the frantic kind, the focused kind. The kind that sharpens your thinking instead of scattering it. I realized that reacting emotionally now would be a mistake. That pleading for belief would only confirm doubt. That arguing would give them exactly what they needed to justify taking things further. So, I stopped reacting. I let the visits continue. I let the questions come. I let my son believe whatever version of events felt easiest for him to hold on to. And I began to observe. By the time the count passed 20, I wasn't measuring days anymore. I was measuring confidence. Hers was growing. So was his. They moved through my life with increasing certainty, as if the outcome had already been decided. They thought I was being managed. They didn't realize I was studying them. The irony of that would have made me smile if I'd still been in the habit of smiling for myself. Instead, I waited, because I understood something they didn't. Once authority shifts quietly, it can only be taken back with proof. And I was done offering anything else. Clarity doesn't arrive with relief. It arrives when pain stops being loud enough to distract you. After the conversation with my son, something inside me went quiet. Not numb. Focused. The hurt was still there, but it had moved out of the way like furniture pushed aside so you can see the floor beneath it. For the first time since all this began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was recognizing. I had seen this kind of game before. Not in my family, not in my home, but in conference rooms where voices stayed polite while decisions were being made that would change lives. In offices where concern was documented carefully and authority shifted hands without anyone raising their voice. I spent decades in environments like that. Places where nothing was said directly and everything was implied. People assume manipulation is emotional, loud, aggressive. They're wrong. The most effective manipulation wears a calm face. It speaks softly. It makes notes. I didn't think about my old career often after I retired. There was no reason to. That chapter of my life felt closed, neatly filed away. But now, patterns I hadn't named in years were lining up in front of me with unsettling precision. Undermine credibility first. Then reframe behavior as concern. Then introduce oversight as protection. I had watched companies do this to employees they wanted gone without lawsuits. I had watched partners do it to one another before hostile takeovers. You don't accuse. You suggest. You don't force. You support. And you never let the target know what's coming until it's already too late to stop. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The visits weren't random. They were structured. The comments weren't careless. They were calibrations. Each interaction tested how much resistance there would be. Each unanswered objection was logged, if not on paper, then in confidence. Most people think reacting is strength. Sometimes it is. But in situations like this, reacting is exactly what the other side wants. Emotion makes you predictable. Predictability makes you manageable. If I confronted her again, she would deny everything. If I pressed harder, concern would escalate. If I raised my voice, my son would hear exactly what he'd been primed to hear. Every outcome led to the same place: loss of control. That was when I understood something that surprised even me. This wasn't about stopping her anymore. This was about stopping what came next. I considered warning my son. Really considered it. Laying everything out. Telling him exactly what was happening, how deliberate it all was. I imagined the conversation in my head, every possible version of it. In each one he listened. In each one he hesitated. And in each one he ultimately chose the path that felt least disruptive to his own life. People don't like to believe the worst about those closest to them, especially when believing it would require action. I knew that if I revealed my awareness too soon, they would adjust, become more careful, change tactics, and then I would be left with suspicion and no proof. So I didn't warn them. I let their confidence grow. From that moment on, I stopped thinking of myself as the subject of their attention. I became the observer. I stopped asking why they were doing this and started asking how often, how bold, how comfortable. It changed everything. Each time I came home to find something moved, I noted it without emotion. Each time she mentioned stopping by, I listened for what she emphasized and what she skipped. Each call from my son became data. The questions, the pauses, the reassurances that weren't really reassurances at all. I wasn't offended anymore. I was analyzing. The anger faded first, then the fear. What replaced them wasn't coldness exactly. It was discipline. The kind you develop when you've learned that timing matters more than volume. I realized why reacting would have destroyed me. If I pushed back publicly, they would frame it as instability. If I demanded boundaries, they would frame it as resistance. If I tried to defend myself emotionally, they would call it confusion. Every move I made in the open would be interpreted through a lens I didn't control. Silence, on the other hand, did something else entirely. It gave them room to move. And people reveal far more when they believe no one is watching. That was the moment silence stopped being something I endured and became something I chose. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. If anything, I softened it. I thanked her more often. I nodded when she made suggestions. I let my son believe his concerns were being heard. Inside, I began preparing. Not dramatically. Not in a way anyone would notice. I didn't rush. I didn't improvise. I followed the same principle I had followed my entire professional life: systems, first, emotions later. I thought in terms of records, timelines, redundancies. I thought about how proof survives scrutiny and how stories don't. I thought about what would hold up if this ever left the realm of family conversation and entered something more formal. I didn't write anything down yet. Writing leaves traces. At this stage, I didn't want traces. I wanted certainty. The realization that hurt the most came quietly one evening while I was washing dishes. I understood that no one was coming to rescue me from this. Not my son, not extended family, not anyone who hadn't lived inside this pattern long enough to see it for what it was. If I wanted my life back, I would have to take it myself. That realization didn't make me bitter. It made me calm. I began to think less about fairness and more about outcome. Fairness is a luxury when power is shifting. Outcome is what remains when it's done. By the end of that week, I had made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable to me just a month earlier. I was going to disappear. Not physically, not permanently, but from their line of sight. No explanations, no warnings, no announcements. I would stop being available without making a show of it. I would let absence speak for me. People assume retreat means defeat. Sometimes it does. Other times it means repositioning. I didn't tell anyone I was going away. I didn't change my routines dramatically. I simply began removing myself from their awareness. Calls went unanswered a little longer. Messages received polite, delayed responses. I became less predictable. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had been monitoring me quietly for weeks. Now, I was about to do the same with far more patience than they expected. I didn't know exactly how this would end yet. I wasn't building toward revenge. That word never felt right. Revenge is loud, messy. It demands an audience. What I wanted was finality. I wanted a moment where facts would exist without my explanation, where the truth wouldn't need my voice to stand upright, where no one could look at me and ask if I was sure. That kind of ending requires restraint. So I waited. I let the count keep rising. I let their certainty harden. And I began preparing for the week when I would no longer be visible at all. They thought silence meant surrender. They had no idea what it actually meant. By the time I stopped being seen, everything was already in motion. I didn't announce that I was stepping back. I just stopped being available. There was no dramatic exit, no packed suitcase by the door, no last conversation meant to settle things. I learned a long time ago that explanations invite debate, and debate invites control. So I offered neither. I let my absence grow quietly, the way mold does behind walls, unnoticed until it's everywhere. The last normal morning came without ceremony. I woke up at the same time I always did, made the same coffee, sat in the same chair. The apartment looked exactly as it always had, which was the point. Nothing sentimental. Nothing I'd miss if it were touched. I moved through each room slowly, not out of nostalgia, but inventory. Locks, windows, corners where sound traveled differently at night. When I left, I locked the door twice, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to remember the feel of it. The resistance, the sound. Muscle memory matters when facts are later questioned. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't go far either. Just far enough to watch without being seen. Far enough to be unreachable without disappearing entirely. I turned my phone face down and left it that way. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing myself for the next call. That alone felt like reclaiming something. The safeguards came next. I didn't install anything flashy. No blinking lights. No alarms that screamed for attention. Loud systems are meant to scare people away. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted records, not deterrents. Quiet systems that noticed things the way I did. Systems that didn't interrupt behavior, only documented it. Every decision I made during that week followed the same rule. If it could alert someone inside the apartment, I didn't use it. If it left a trace that could be noticed too early, I avoided it. This wasn't about catching someone once. It was about capturing a pattern. Then I waited. The first entry after I stepped back came sooner than I expected. I didn't see it happen. I didn't need to. I felt it in the shift of things. A notification I didn't open right away, a timestamp that told me enough without details. The count moved forward. I didn't react. That was harder than I thought it would be. Every instinct in me wanted to intervene, to call my son, to say this has gone far enough. But instincts are habits, and habits can be retrained. I reminded myself why I was doing this. Stopping it now would only create another conversation, another interpretation, another version of events that didn't belong to me. So I let it continue. Each entry strengthened the record. Each time she came in, she stayed a little longer. The movements grew less careful. The pauses grew shorter. People behave differently when they think they're unobserved. They stop pretending. They stop tidying. They stop worrying about how things look. I watched confidence replace caution. There were moments when my resolve wavered. Once I saw a change that felt too personal to ignore. Something moved that carried memory with it. I had to sit down and breathe through the urge to end everything right there. It would have been easy to step in, easy to call the police, easy to expose her then, easy but incomplete. I reminded myself that this was no longer about a single violation. It was about proving intent. One mistake can be explained away. Repetition cannot. Time was doing my work for me as long as I let it. Silence became physical. I noticed it in the way my shoulders relaxed without the constant anticipation of confrontation. I noticed it in the way my thoughts sharpened when I wasn't rehearsing arguments I'd never make. Being unreachable felt strange at first, like stepping outside without shoes. But after a few days, it felt natural. My phone buzzed. I didn't pick it up. A message came through. I didn't read it. I wasn't ignoring them out of spite. I was allowing absence to speak. When people can't reach you, they start filling the gaps themselves. They create narratives. They make assumptions. Those assumptions guide their next move. That's what I was waiting for. Midweek, I noticed the first signs of overconfidence. Entries began happening at different times. Less predictable. Sometimes earlier in the day, sometimes later. Once, well past midnight. There was no attempt to hide the fact of entry anymore. Doors were locked again afterward, but without care. The lock turned, but the ritual was gone. I recognized that shift immediately. It's the moment when someone stops worrying about consequences because they believe they've already won. My son's calls became more frequent. I didn't answer them. Not right away. When I did respond, it was brief, polite, non-committal. I didn't argue. I didn't reassure. I didn't explain. I thanked him for checking in and told him I was resting. Resting is a powerful word. It suggests compliance without giving anything away. He left a voicemail one evening that I listened to once and then deleted. His voice sounded strained, concerned, confused. He asked where I was, asked if I was okay, asked me to call him back. I didn't. The loneliness hit hardest at night. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles in when you know you're choosing distance. It's not the same as being alone by circumstance. This was deliberate isolation, and it carried weight. I missed my wife in those moments more than usual. Missed the way she would have read the situation without my having to explain it. But I didn't second-guess myself. By the end of the week, the count reached 35 marriages. 35 times in 3 months, my space had been entered without my consent. 35 times the narrative of concern had been used as cover. And now, with my absence, those visits were no longer about checking on me. They were about control. I could see it in the way things were handled. Drawers left open longer. Items moved with purpose, not curiosity. There was no pretense of tidying anymore. The behavior had crossed from access into interference. That told me everything I needed to know. I checked my systems one last time, not because I doubted them, but because rituals matter. Each piece was functioning exactly as intended. Redundancies in place, records intact. Nothing left to chance. I sat back and waited. The final entry hadn't happened yet, but I could feel it approaching. The pattern had tightened. The confidence had peaked. There was only one way this could escalate further. It wouldn't happen during the day. It wouldn't happen casually. It would happen when they believed no one was watching, no one was coming, and no one would question what they did next. I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel fear. I felt ready. By the time the week ended, I understood something with absolute clarity. Silence hadn't weakened me. It had stripped away everything unnecessary. All that remained was focus. One entry was left, and when it came, it would not be quiet. Traps aren't built with force. They're built with assumptions. Once I understood that everything I did became quieter, slower, and far more deliberate. I didn't need to lure anyone into my apartment. I didn't need to provoke another confrontation. All I had to do was stop correcting the story they were already telling themselves. I let my absence be noticed, not dramatically, not in a way that raised alarms. I simply stopped answering messages right away. I stopped returning calls the same day. When I did respond, I kept it short. Polite, vague. I didn't explain where I was or what I was doing. I let them fill in the blanks. People hate empty space. They rush to fill it. The apartment became part of that silence. I didn't clear it out. I didn't lock everything away. I left it looking exactly the way someone would expect an old man's place to look if he were overwhelmed or distracted. Not messy, not abandoned, just unattended enough to invite interpretation. A few papers stayed on the desk where I usually kept them neatly filed. Not important ones, not complete ones, just enough to suggest activity without clarity. A jacket draped over the back of a chair, a mug left in the sink. Small signs of life paused mid-thought. I knew what those details would suggest. I left the safe where it could be seen. It had always been there, tucked into the corner of a closet, unremarkable if you weren't looking for it. I didn't move it closer. I didn't draw attention to it directly. I simply made sure it wasn't hidden anymore. The door slightly ajar, the outline unmistakable to anyone scanning the room with purpose. The safe was never about money. That was the irony of it. People assume safes mean cash jewelry secrets worth stealing. What they really mean is possibility. And possibility is far more tempting than certainty. I didn't need her to want what was inside. I needed her to believe it mattered. From a distance, I watched behavior change. Entries became more frequent again, longer, less careful. There was no attempt to tidy afterward anymore. Things were left as they were. Drawers open, chairs moved and not returned to place. Whoever was coming in felt entitled, now not cautious. That was the signal I'd been waiting for. When people feel watched, they behave. When they feel unchallenged, they reveal themselves. I resisted the urge to intervene more than once. There were moments when I saw something happen and felt the instinctive pull to end it immediately. To step in, to stop the violation before it went any further. Each time I reminded myself that stopping it too soon would cost me the ending I needed. This wasn't about catching someone once. It was about letting them cross a line so clearly that no explanation could blur it afterward. Patience is easier when you're young. When you're older, patience carries weight. Every day you wait, you ask yourself if it's worth it, if peace might be cheaper than proof. I decided proof was cheaper. The behavior shifted from access to interference. That distinction matters. Access is entering a space. Interference is acting like you own it. I noticed things being moved with intent. Not curiosity, not checking. Decisions. Papers stacked in different orders. Objects relocated in ways that made no sense unless someone was trying to understand how I lived or how I thought. I saw confidence settle in. That confidence wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in timing. Entries happening later at night. Longer pauses before leaving. Less concern about being noticed. Whoever was doing this believed the story completely now. The story where I was fading. The story where my absence meant weakness. The story where no one would question what happened inside that apartment. I checked my systems again. Not because I doubted them. Because ritual steadies the mind. Each component was working exactly as designed. Quiet, redundant, patient, they weren't there to stop anything. They were there to remember. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. not my son, not friends, not neighbors. Silence only works when it's complete. The moment you share it, it changes shape. I needed this silence to remain untouched. My phone rang one evening, and I let it ring until it stopped. Another message came through. I read it this time. My son asking where I was, asking if I was okay, asking me to please call him back. I felt the familiar pull of guilt. Then I remembered the questions he'd asked me weeks earlier. The tone, the doubt. I reminded myself that he hadn't asked those questions to protect me. He'd asked them to reassure himself. I didn't reply. The next entry happened close to midnight. I could tell from the timestamps alone. There was no rush this time, no checking and leaving. Whoever entered stayed. Long enough to move things, long enough to decide. That was when I knew the final line was close. I sat with that knowledge longer than I expected, not out of fear, but reflection. 70 years gives you a strange relationship with endings. You learn to recognize them before they arrive. You learn that some endings don't come with raised voices or slammed doors. They come quietly with certainty. I felt no anger toward her then, or even toward my son. I felt clarity. This wasn't about them anymore. It was about me. About whether I would allow the last years of my life to be managed by assumptions I didn't create. About whether I would be reduced to a version of myself that was easier for others to control. I wasn't willing to accept that. I reviewed everything one last time. Not the evidence, the intention. I had not staged anything falsely. I had not exaggerated a single moment. I had not provoked. I had simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own confidence. That mattered to me. The next entry would not be casual. I could feel it in the tightening of the pattern. In the way timing narrowed. In the way care had vanished completely from the behavior. It wouldn't happen during the day. It wouldn't happen quickly. It wouldn't be quiet. I saw the time appear on the system once hours before it meant anything, a small detail most people would ignore. To me, it was confirmation. 2 a.m. That was when people act on what they believe no one will challenge. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, because I was alert. There's a difference. Anxiety scatters your thoughts. Alertness sharpens them. I sat with the quiet and let it do its work. Everything was in place. Nothing left to chance. No more adjustments to make. No more decisions to reconsider. The space had been prepared. The silence had done its job. The assumptions were fully formed. All that remained was for them to act on them. And when they did, they wouldn't just cross a boundary. They would expose themselves. I didn't need to move. I didn't need to speak. I didn't need to interfere. I only needed to wait. Because the next sound in my life wouldn't be a voice. It would be a door. I thought I understood everything that was happening. That turned out to be my last mistake. Up to that point, I believed the worst of it was contained inside my apartment. Doors opening, things moving, lines being crossed quietly. I believed that if I controlled the space, I controlled the story. What I didn't see yet was how much of the story was being written somewhere else. The first sign came through my phone. It wasn't a missed call or a casual text. It was a voicemail left in a tone I hadn't heard from my son before. Not worried, not annoyed, official. The kind of voice people use when they've rehearsed what they're about to say and want to make sure they say it correctly. I listened to it once, standing in a borrowed kitchen that didn't belong to me, the sound of his voice echoing off walls that had no history with us. He said my name carefully, asked me to call him back when I had a moment, said there were a few things he wanted to talk about. Important things. He emphasized the word important like it was meant to soften what came next. I didn't call him back right away. I listened to the message again, slower this time. I paid attention not just to what he said, but to what he didn't. He didn't ask where I was. He didn't ask if I was safe. He didn't sound relieved that I hadn't disappeared completely. He sounded like someone who had already decided what the problem was. When I did call him back later that day, he answered quickly as if he'd been waiting with the phone in his hand. He told me he was glad to hear from me, told me he'd been worried. Then he shifted smoothly into the part he actually wanted to talk about. He said he and his wife had been talking. That was the phrase that mattered. He said they were concerned about how I'd been handling things lately. He said my absence had made them uneasy. He said it might be time to involve some professionals just to be safe. Advisors. People who knew how to assess situations like this objectively. Objectively. I let him talk. He explained that no one was accusing me of anything. That this wasn't about blame. That it was about making sure everyone was protected. He said words like evaluation and support and next steps. He said them gently, as if he were offering me a favor I'd be foolish to refuse. I felt something settle in my stomach as he spoke. A heavy, familiar feeling. This wasn't new. I had seen this structure before. The moment when concern becomes documentation. When conversations turn into records. When decisions begin moving without the person they're about. I asked him what prompted this. He hesitated. Then he said my wife had noticed certain things. My absence, my silence, the fact that I wasn't answering calls the way I used to. He said she was worried I might not be coping as well as I thought. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the symmetry of it was almost elegant. My silence, chosen to protect myself, was now being repurposed as evidence against me. I didn't argue. Arguing would have been easy. I could have told him exactly where I was. I could have explained why I'd stepped back. I could have laid out every detail of what had been happening in my apartment. Every unauthorized entry, every shift in behavior, every line that had been crossed. I didn't do any of that. Because I understood something in that moment that sharpened everything else. If I revealed my hand now, they would pivot. If I exposed the intrusion, they would minimize it. If I mentioned evidence, they would grow cautious. The entire structure depended on them believing they were in control. And they still believed that. I told my son I was fine. I told him I appreciated his concern. I told him I needed time to think. He didn't push. He didn't need to. The pressure was already built into the situation. Silence, once again, was being mistaken for weakness. After the call ended, I sat alone for a long time. This was bigger than I'd planned for. Up until then, I had been preparing for exposure. For a moment where behavior inside my apartment would become undeniable. What I hadn't fully accounted for was how quickly that moment could be overtaken by something else. A legal process. A formal assessment. A narrative with authority behind it. They weren't just invading my space anymore. They were preparing to erase my voice. That realization hurt more than anything else so far. Not because it was cruel, but because it was efficient. There is a particular kind of betrayal that comes from being managed by people who insist they're helping you. I didn't panic. Panic belongs to people who think they're running out of time. I understood instead that time had become more valuable than ever. That whatever happened next needed to happen cleanly, completely, in a way that couldn't be reframed. I thought about the next entry into my apartment. Up until then, it had been about access, about familiarity, about testing limits. Now, with professionals potentially entering the picture, access would become necessity. They would need something. Documents, confirmation, leverage, the safe. I understood then why my instincts had kept circling back to it. Not because of what was inside, but because of what it represented. Control, finality, proof that could be interpreted or misinterpreted depending on who found it and how. If they were going to make a move, they would need to justify it. And justification requires evidence, even if it's manufactured through assumption. That meant the next entry wouldn't be casual. It wouldn't be another quiet check-in. It wouldn't be about tidying or observing. It would be decisive. They would act because they believed they had to, and that belief would push them too far. I felt the emotional cost of knowing this settle over me that night. Not fear, not anger, grief. Grief for the simplicity that was gone. For the version of my son who would have believed me without hesitation. For the idea that family conflict could still be resolved with honesty alone. That version of events was no longer available. I checked my systems again slower this time. Not just to confirm they were working, but to remind myself why they were there. Every timestamp, every quiet record, every redundant measure existed for one reason: to let the truth exist without my permission. I wasn't preparing to defend myself anymore. I was preparing to end the story. The weight of that settled in my chest, heavy but steady. I understood then why people cling to denial. Clarity is expensive. It costs relationships. It costs illusions. It costs the comfort of being misunderstood, but loved. I chose clarity anyway. When the final entry happened, it would no longer be ambiguous. No amount of concern could soften it. No amount of explanation could reframe it. It would cross from assumption into action. They would expose themselves not because I forced them to, but because they believed they were entitled to. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind wouldn't let go of the implications. This was no longer just about stopping intrusion. It was about stopping a process that would have continued until I was no longer considered capable of speaking for myself. I understood now what was truly at stake. The next entry wouldn't just decide what happened to my apartment. It would decide what happened to me. And when it came, it needed to be unmistakable. I didn't rush it. I didn't interfere. I didn't warn anyone. I let them keep planning. Because people are most dangerous when they believe they're acting responsibly, and most vulnerable when they believe no one is watching. The quiet that night felt deliberate, not peaceful, not empty. It was the kind of silence that settles in when something is gathering momentum just out of sight. There were no messages waiting on my phone, no missed calls, no movement alerts. The absence of noise pressed against my awareness harder than any sound had before. I had learned to trust that feeling. I positioned myself where I could observe without interfering. Not inside the apartment, not close enough to change the outcome. Distance mattered now. The moment I stepped in too early, the story would fracture into interpretations. I needed it whole. Waiting is an active thing when you do it correctly. It isn't passive. It requires discipline. I slowed my breathing and let my thoughts line up instead of racing ahead. I reminded myself that nothing I did tonight should influence what happened next. This had to unfold on its own. Time stretched in strange ways. Minutes felt like hours, then collapsed back into themselves. I resisted checking the system repeatedly. Compulsion creates patterns, and patterns create mistakes. I checked only when it mattered. As I waited, a memory surfaced uninvited. Years ago, long before retirement, I had sat in a conference room while a senior partner explained why a project needed to continue just a little longer. Everyone around the table knew it was already failing. The numbers said so. But stopping too early would have allowed the wrong people to rewrite the ending. Waiting was the only way to make the truth undeniable. That night felt the same. I remembered how difficult it had been to keep quiet then. How every instinct had screamed to intervene, and how waiting had ultimately done the work no argument ever could. The first anomaly appeared just after midnight. It was subtle, a minor deviation in a pattern I had come to know well. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. The kind of thing most people would overlook entirely. I noticed it immediately. Something had shifted. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't alert anyone. I noted the change and let it exist without reaction. Confirmation would come on its own if I allowed it. This was the hardest part. When you know what's coming, restraint becomes a physical sensation. My jaw tightened. My hands curled and then relaxed. I reminded myself that reacting now would only shorten the arc. The arc mattered. Minutes passed, then more. The system remained quiet but not empty. The absence of alerts told me more than any notification could. Activity was approaching the threshold where silence itself becomes suspicious. I glanced at the clock without meaning to. The hour was edging closer to morning. I thought about my son, then not with anger, but with a detached sadness. I wondered if he was asleep, if he believed this was all being handled responsibly, if he understood how close we were to something irreversible. I pushed the thought away. This wasn't the night for second-guessing. Another small deviation appeared. This time there was no mistaking it. A sequence had begun. Slow, intentional. I felt my pulse quick, and not from fear, but from certainty. The pattern I had been waiting for was finally aligning. I stayed still. I had learned long ago that the moment before something happens is often louder than the event itself. The anticipation sharpens your senses. Every sound feels amplified. Every shadow seems meaningful. Then time did something strange. It slowed. I watched the minutes tick forward, each one heavy and distinct. I didn't count them. Counting would have anchored me to impatience. I let them pass. I ran through contingencies in my mind, not to adjust them, but to accept them. Once this crossed the line, there would be no undoing it. That thought didn't frighten me. It steadied me. I checked one last time. Everything was in place. I felt it before I saw it. There is a moment when intuition overtakes observation, when your body reacts before your mind catches up. My shoulders tightened. My breath paused. The certainty settled deep, unmistakable. This was it. The confirmation came quietly, without drama. No alarms, no alerts meant to startle. Just the clear, irreversible indication that the boundary had been crossed deliberately. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I noted the time, 2 a.m. The significance of that hour was not lost on me. It is the hour people choose when they believe no one will question them. When plausible deniability feels strongest. When the world is asleep enough to be ignored. I understood then exactly why it had taken this long. Everything before had been preparation, testing, conditioning. This was the action they had been working toward, whether they knew it consciously or not. I let the moment exist without interruption. Inside my chest, something released. Not relief, not triumph, resolution. The waiting was over. The ambiguity had ended. From this point forward, nothing could be reframed as misunderstanding. I thought again of the apartment, of the first unlocked door, of the laugh when I asked her to stop, of my son's careful questions. All of it led here compressed into a single, undeniable act. I didn't need to see every detail to understand what was happening. The pattern had already told me enough. The intent was clear. The line was crossed. I remained where I was. The temptation to intervene was still there, flickering at the edges of my resolve. To end it immediately, to step in and stop whatever came next. I acknowledged the temptation and let it pass. Ending it now would have turned this into an argument. Letting it continue would turn it into fact. I chose fact. As the minutes moved forward, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The kind that arrives when a long uncertainty finally resolves itself. There would be consequences now, but they would belong to actions, not interpretations. I thought about the word care, how often it had been used to justify everything leading up to this point. How empty it sounded now. Care doesn't break locks. Care doesn't choose 2 a.m. Care doesn't hide. I waited until the system confirmed what I already knew. Then I waited a little longer, not because I was unsure, because timing still mattered, because endings deserve the same patience as beginnings. When I finally shifted my weight, it wasn't in haste. It was with intention. The night had done its work. The story had reached the point where it could no longer be bent. I looked at the clock once more. 2 in the morning had passed, but its mark remained. What happened next would not be quiet. And for the first time since all of this began, I felt no need to be. The waiting was over. Everything else would follow. The moment the line was crossed, everything became simple. There was no rush of adrenaline, no surge of anger, just clarity, clean and unmistakable. The kind that arrives when doubt finally has nowhere left to hide. Whatever this had been pretending to be before, it wasn't that anymore. It was a crime in progress, unfolding exactly as I had expected it would. I watched it happen without intervening. The entry wasn't hurried. That was the first thing that struck me. Whoever came through the door did so with the confidence of someone who believed they belonged there. No fumbling, no hesitation. The lock yielded not because it had failed, but because it had been handled with familiarity. That detail mattered. This wasn't panic. This wasn't fear-driven impulse. This was intent. Movement inside the apartment followed a pattern I had already seen building over weeks, direct, purposeful. The behavior no longer resembled checking or concern. It resembled ownership. Rooms were entered in sequence, not wandered through. Time was spent where it mattered, not wasted where it didn't. I felt something settle in my chest as I observed it. Not satisfaction, confirmation. This was the moment when every excuse evaporated. There was no tidying, no pretending to look after me. No sign of hesitation that could later be described as confusion or misunderstanding. Whatever narrative had once existed collapsed under the weight of action. Then the attention shifted. Toward the closet. Toward the safe. I had known this would happen long before it did. Objects like that don't go unnoticed by people who feel entitled. They draw focus. They promise answers. They suggest leverage. The safe was approached carefully at first, studied, evaluated. I could almost feel the calculation happening, the moment where curiosity turns into decision. That was when I knew there would be no turning back. I didn't reveal what was inside. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the contents, but the act itself. The choice to cross from access into violation, from assumption into action. I activated the silent alert. No sirens, no flashing lights. Nothing inside the apartment that would warn anyone of what had just been set in motion. Silence was still my ally. Silence used correctly is devastating. Once the alert was sent, there was nothing more for me to do. I waited. The waiting felt different now. Heavier, but also complete. Like a task you've prepared for so thoroughly that execution becomes almost secondary. I didn't pace. I didn't check repeatedly. I sat still and let the process unfold the way it was meant to. Minutes passed. Inside the apartment, movement continued, uninterrupted, unaware. I thought briefly about my son, about what he believed was happening right now. I wondered if he was asleep, secure in the assumption that everything was under control, that professionals would step in if necessary, that concern would prevail. He had no idea how little control anyone had at this point. The arrival of authority was quiet. No dramatic entrance, no shouting. Just the unmistakable shift that happens when power changes hands. Doors opened that had not been opened by permission. Voices spoke that did not ask to be heard. The difference was immediate. Confidence drained out of the room like air from a punctured tire. The movements that had been assured seconds earlier became stiff. The posture changed. Shoulders tightened. Explanations began forming too late to matter. I observed without emotion. This wasn't vindication. It wasn't triumph. It was inevitability playing itself out. Questions were asked. Not accusatory, precise. Answers were attempted, incomplete. The kind that rely on context instead of fact. Context evaporates under scrutiny. Facts do not. The narrative that had been built around me didn't survive its first contact with reality. No one needed my testimony. That was the most satisfying part, though I wouldn't have called it satisfaction then. I had worked toward this outcome deliberately. I had wanted the truth to exist without my voice attached to it, to stand on its own, to be immune to reinterpretation. It did. Documentation was checked, timelines aligned, actions matched records too closely to be coincidence. There was no room left for concern-based justification. The story had collapsed under its own weight. I remained silent. Not out of fear, not out of shock, out of respect for the process. Over-explaining weakens truth. I had learned that long ago. The first real consequence appeared not in handcuffs or raised voices, but in the sudden absence of authority from the person who had wielded it so freely before. The shift was visible, palpable. Control is loud when it exists and deafening when it disappears. My son arrived later. I didn't watch that part unfold directly. I didn't need to. I could hear it in his voice when he spoke to me afterward. The confusion, the recalibration, the dawning realization that what he thought he understood had been incomplete. He didn't accuse, he didn't defend. He asked questions. That was enough. I answered simply, briefly. I did not recount events emotionally. I did not list grievances. I didn't need to. Everything that mattered was already documented. My role had ended the moment the facts began speaking for themselves. What struck me most in the aftermath was how quickly everything unraveled. Weeks of quiet manipulation, months of careful framing, all of it undone in minutes once behavior crossed the line it never should have approached. Power that relies on assumption is fragile. It shatters the moment it's tested. I didn't feel relief right away. Relief comes when danger passes. This was different. This was resolution. The knowledge that something had ended decisively. That there would be no more guessing. No more careful silence required. I returned to my apartment later that night. It felt different. Not violated anymore. Not tense. Just exposed like a room after a storm has passed through. The air was still, heavy with the echo of what had happened. I walked through slowly, not inspecting, not cataloging damage. There was nothing to recover. Nothing meaningful had been taken. What had been lost was something else entirely. Illusion. The illusion that concern could excuse control. The illusion that silence meant weakness. The illusion that age made me incapable of protecting myself. Those illusions were gone now. I sat down in my chair and let the quiet settle properly for the first time in weeks. The adrenaline drained away, leaving behind a calm that felt earned. I thought about how close this had come to ending differently. How easily it could have slipped into something I wouldn't have been able to stop once it gained momentum. That thought stayed with me longer than the rest. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. There would be consequences beyond this night. Conversations, distance, decisions that would reshape relationships permanently. I understood that. I accepted it. But the hardest part was over. The trap had closed exactly when it needed to. And everything that followed would be built on truth, not interpretation. For the first time in months, I slept without listening for the sound of my door. The waiting was done. Now came the reckoning. When the noise faded, the truth had nowhere left to hide. The apartment felt different once authority stepped in. Not calmer exactly, but stripped bare. Like a stage after the actors leave and the lights come up. Everything that had been whispered and implied for months was suddenly exposed under a neutral, unblinking light. I stayed out of the way. That wasn't humility. It was intention. I had learned that once facts are in motion, the worst thing you can do is crowd them with emotion. So I watched from the side, silent, while the story that had been built around me began to collapse under its own contradictions. There was no shouting. That surprised me at first. I had expected raised voices, maybe anger, maybe tears. None of that came. What replaced it was procedural calm. Questions asked slowly, clarifications requested, timelines compared. The kind of conversation where confidence evaporates sentence by sentence. I could see it in her posture. The woman who had walked into my apartment with certainty now stood differently, shoulders tense, hands restless. The easy authority she'd carried for weeks was gone. In its place was something thinner, defensive, uncertain. She tried to explain, not all at once, carefully, piece by piece. She framed her presence as concern. She spoke about worry, about responsibility, about how she had only ever meant to help. Each explanation leaned heavily on intention. Intentions don't matter when actions are documented. That was the problem she couldn't solve. The evidence didn't argue back. It didn't care how caring she claimed to be. It didn't care how reasonable her tone sounded. Dates lined up, times repeated. Entries formed patterns too consistent to dismiss. The truth didn't need embellishment. I noticed how quickly her language shifted. Concern became misunderstanding. Misunderstanding became miscommunication. Miscommunication became a mistake. The words slid around, searching for something solid to land on. They found nothing. At one point, she stopped talking altogether. That silence was different from mine. Hers was empty. Mine had been chosen. My son arrived later. I knew he would. The situation had moved beyond quiet management into something that demanded his presence. When he walked into the room, his face told me everything before he spoke. He looked lost. Not angry, not defensive, just disoriented. The kind of expression people wear when two versions of reality collide and neither survives intact. He glanced at me, then at her, then back again, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had believed. I didn't rush to meet his eyes. I let him take it in at his own pace. He asked what had happened, not in accusation, in disbelief. The answer came from the room, not from me, from the records, from the sequence of events, from the undeniable fact that someone had crossed a line that could not be reframed as care. I watched his face change as the pieces fell into place. Slowly, painfully. This was not the moment of apology people imagine in stories like this. There were no tears, no sudden confessions, just realization, the heavy kind that settles in your chest and stays there. He didn't look at me right away. When he did, his eyes were searching, as if asking a question he wasn't ready to say out loud. I didn't answer it. I didn't need to. Answers offered too quickly often cheapen the truth. I spoke very little that night. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I had already said everything that mattered without words. Over-explaining would have weakened what the facts had established. Silence in this moment wasn't strategy anymore. It was dignity. I noticed something else as the night wore on. No one questioned my memory. No one suggested confusion. No one spoke about oversight or evaluation. The narrative that had been built so carefully around my supposed fragility evaporated the moment it met resistance. Not from me, but from reality itself. That was when I felt it. Not satisfaction, not revenge. Relief. The kind that comes not from winning, but from no longer having to defend your own sanity. Later, when the immediate aftermath settled and people began to leave, my son asked if we could talk. Just the two of us. We stood in the hallway, the same neutral space where so many of these conversations had taken place before. This time the balance felt different. He didn't start with an apology. That might surprise some people. It didn't surprise me. Apologies require clarity, and clarity takes time. What he offered instead was honesty. He said he hadn't known. He said he'd believed he was doing the right thing. He said he hadn't wanted to see me hurt, and he hadn't known how else to handle the situation. I listened. I didn't argue with him. I didn't interrupt. I didn't tell him he should have trusted me. That lesson was already carving itself into him more deeply than any words I could offer. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then I told him the truth. I told him I had known something was wrong from the beginning. I told him I had asked for it to stop. I told him I had chosen silence because speaking had already cost me belief. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I told him calmly, because calm was the only tone that fit the moment. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. I could see the weight of it settling on him. The realization that good intentions don't protect you from consequences. That loyalty misplaced can do real harm. We didn't resolve everything that night. That's not how real life works. What we did do was acknowledge that something had changed permanently. Trust doesn't snap back into place once it's broken. It has to be rebuilt, if it can be rebuilt at all. I accepted that. Later, alone again, I walked through my apartment. Not to inspect damage, not to catalog what had been touched. I already knew nothing important was missing. What mattered had never been physical. I sat in my chair and let the quiet return this time without tension. The space felt mine again. Not because it was empty, but because it was honest. I thought about how close this had come to ending differently. How easily the narrative could have swallowed me if I had reacted emotionally instead of deliberately. That thought stayed with me longer than anything else. Being proven right is not a celebration. It's a cost. You pay for it with relationships, with illusions, with the comfort of believing that those closest to you will always see you clearly. I felt the weight of that loss then, fully and without denial. But beneath it all, there was something solid. Agency. I had not been erased. I had not been managed into silence. I had stood still long enough for the truth to stand with me. That mattered. As the night finally ended and the world began to return to its ordinary rhythms, I knew one thing with certainty. The legal situation had resolved itself quickly. The personal consequences were just beginning. And whatever came next, I would meet it with my eyes open, my boundaries intact, and my voice firmly my own. The story they tried to tell about me had collapsed. What remained was the truth, and I was still standing inside it. The morning after felt quieter than it should have. Not empty, not fragile. Just settled the way a room feels after you finally name what's been hanging in the air for too long. I unlocked my door slowly and stepped back into the apartment alone, without witnesses, without explanations waiting to be made. Nothing was broken. That was the first thing I noticed. No overturned furniture, no scattered papers, no sign of chaos. If someone had walked in without knowing what happened the night before, they would have seen the same modest space I had lived in for years. A place shaped by habit, not drama. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet, and realized something important. This place had never been the problem. I moved through the rooms at my own pace, not inspecting, not reclaiming, just noticing. The chair by the window, the table where I drank my coffee, the drawer that had been opened too many times without permission. Everything was still where it belonged. What had changed wasn't the space. It was the certainty. For months I had lived with a low hum of doubt in the background, a constant calculation, a sense that I needed to be careful even in my own home. That hum was gone now. In its place was something steadier, a quiet confidence that didn't need to announce itself. I made coffee and sat down. The mug felt warm in my hands, familiar, ordinary. That mattered more than I expected. It reminded me that nothing truly valuable had been taken from me despite how close it had come. The danger had never been about objects or money or documents. It had been about control. I thought about the word revenge and how easily people reach for it when they hear stories like mine. They imagine anger, punishment, satisfaction in someone else's downfall. I understood the appeal, but it never fit what I felt. I hadn't wanted to hurt anyone. I had wanted the truth to exist where it couldn't be dismissed. There's a difference. Revenge is loud. It needs witnesses. It needs validation. What I wanted was quieter. Resolution. An ending that didn't depend on anyone believing me out of sympathy. I wanted facts. Once those facts existed, I didn't need to say much at all. Later that day, I took care of practical things. Keys were returned, access was revoked, boundaries were set without argument. I didn't justify any of it. I didn't explain my reasoning. I simply acted. Authority doesn't need to raise its voice when it's legitimate. The conversations that followed were restrained. My son and I spoke again briefly, not to rehash what had happened, but to acknowledge what had changed. There were no dramatic reconciliations, no promises that everything would go back to the way it was. Some things don't. I told him I loved him. I told him I needed space. I told him I would reach out when I was ready. He didn't argue. That in its own way was an apology. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing someone you raised no longer knows how to see you clearly. Not because they don't care, but because the world taught them a different language of authority, one that values convenience over closeness. I accepted that grief without trying to fix it. Fixing everything isn't a requirement for peace. That afternoon, I opened the windows and let fresh air move through the apartment. I changed the sheets, threw out a few things I no longer needed. Small acts, grounding ones, the kind that remind you that life continues in details, not declarations. At 70, you learn something most people don't understand yet. Time doesn't make you weaker. It makes you selective. You stop wasting energy on arguments that go nowhere. You stop chasing validation from people who have already decided who you are. You stop explaining yourself to anyone who benefits from misunderstanding you. Age gives you leverage if you know how to use it. What this experience taught me more than anything was that silence is not surrender. Silence chosen deliberately is restraint. It is observation. It is patience sharpened into something useful. But silence is only powerful when it's paired with clarity. Without clarity, silence erases you. With clarity, it protects you. I didn't become invisible because I was afraid. I became invisible because I needed the truth to reveal itself without interference. And when it did, I stepped back into my life without asking permission. That matters. In the days that followed, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Calm. Not the fragile calm of avoidance, but the grounded calm of someone who knows where they stand. I slept through the night. I stopped listening for my door. I stopped replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I should have said differently. I had said enough by doing nothing at all. If you're listening to this and something in it feels familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. Being told you're overreacting doesn't mean you're wrong. Being dismissed doesn't mean you're confused. And needing proof doesn't mean you're powerless. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is explain yourself to people who have already decided not to understand you. Sometimes the strongest response is patience. And sometimes reclaiming your dignity doesn't look like winning. It looks like taking your life back quietly on your own terms. If you've ever had your boundaries crossed and been told it was for your own good, I'd like to hear your story. You're not alone, even if it felt that way at the time. Share your thoughts in the comments. Someone else might need to read them. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about dignity, justice, and quiet strength in the face of betrayal, stay with this channel. There are more truths like this waiting to be told. Sometimes the loudest statement you can make is choosing not to argue anymore. Sometimes silence is how you survive. And sometimes silence is how you win.